Thanks to Stefan for the invitation and to Create for hosting this event. Also, I should say about Create, it just came up over we were just a happenstance over lunch. Ruth Towse's name came up as again someone who's involved, I understand they're at the creation of Create, and she's important, to me in my own research. She was especially her work as an economist on intellectual property and copyright. Pointing out the thing that was really interesting for me to come across when I started working on this, it would be about 2006 or so, as a voice pointing out how little empirical research that there actually is on basically the effects of copyright for something that I didn't know anything about copyright at the time, and so I did know it was around for hundreds of years. And so that kind of fact that there wasn't a really strong empirical base for it kind of scandalized me. So and so it's very also nice to hear that how much work Create has been doing on just trying to build that evidentiary base. So so we definitely cite Professor Towse in my dissertation, in my first book, and also she cited in here as well. All on that lines there about what does the evidence tell us about, in this case, intellectual property? So yes, Natasha sends her regrets, and she's very disappointed that she can't be here today. We've done about a dozen or so of these presentations of the book in Europe and in Canada, but this is actually the first one that either one of us has done solo. So I'm going to do my best to do justice to both her part of the book and also her part of the presentation. So we'll see how that works out. The book itself represents the culmination of the last decade or so of our research. It brings together a number of subjects such as copyright and intellectual property. Let's see this. How do we move this forward? Okay, I think we figured it out. So we'll see if this works. So my first book focused on the politics of copyright. And Natasha's first book focused on the governance by and through platforms. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to go over the argument in our latest book. And because this is an academic event, first I'm going to focus on our theoretical framework, and then I will discuss a few examples that illustrate the changing nature of power in what we call the knowledge-driven society. And throughout, I'm going to develop one of our main arguments, which is that the primary objective for governments in regulating the knowledge-driven society should not be to maximize the economic utility of knowledge, but to limit its commodification in the first place, which is a process that we call knowledge decommodification, and we'll get to that in kind of the last part of the presentation. So the book itself is an attempt to understand and explain some strange phenomena that have come up over the past couple of decades related to knowledge governance. So for example, intellectual property rights have become a central part of international trade agreements, but they're still treated as secondary issues and not analyzed the way that tariffs are. So again, this would be, me drawing on Ruth Towse's work. You have smart city projects that are still thought of in terms of physical infrastructure rather than in terms of data and IP. You have networked products, the Internet of Things, that are transforming the terms of control and nature of ownership of physical goods. You have tech companies and computer scientists being treated as experts in every policy field imaginable. You also have liberal democracies embracing total surveillance policies that in a previous era would be more associated with totalitarian dictatorships. And I think this is something that probably lands harder in the UK and especially in London than in a lot of other places in the world. And on top of that, we've had one tech fad after another, from crypto to NFTs to Web3. Remember Web3? To artificial intelligence and large language models, all of which promise to upend everything, with this kind of utopian promise that never seems to actually get delivered. And we argue that these things are all part of the same phenomenon related to the rising importance of the control over knowledge as a vector of power. We also argue not just that tech or data or IP is becoming increasingly important, but that we're witnessing a fundamental transformation in the nature of what we consider to be knowledge itself. And this transformation is having a systemic effect on the entire global political economy. This is a world in which commodified knowledge, primarily in the form of data and intellectual property, trump other forms of knowledge and create challenges that are very similar to those that Karl Polanyi warned us about almost 80 years ago when he discussed the marketization of society. It's also a world that a lot of policymakers aren't fully prepared for. And again, sometimes we're talking about, it's definitely 100% true in the case of Canada, probably a little bit less true in the European Union and the UK, but also I think there's still a learning curve going on. For example, it matters that trade negotiators continue to treat IP and data as afterthoughts in trade agreements, or that municipal officials often undervalue the importance of data governance when contemplating smart city projects. And so we wrote the book for these people. So it's the officials, the regular citizens, who are trying to make sense of a world in which previously esoteric ideas are things like data and intellectual property being something that famously terrifies even other lawyers who aren't IP experts. But everyone is now being forced to understand exactly what these are and how they affect the rest of the world. They're gaining everyday relevance. So we wanted to try to explain the nature and logic of a knowledge-driven society. First off, though, we should probably, I'm going to start by defining our core terms, which is something we make a point of doing in the book itself. So we noticed in reading a lot of the literature in this area that a lot of times authors they might treat the words data or information or knowledge as the definitions as being self-evident or uncontroversial, when in fact, of course, they're highly contested terms, and different people mean different things when they talk about all three of these things. So we think it's important to lay our cards on the table by what we mean by this, even if it's like not exactly, these aren't consensus definitions because there are no consensus definitions. So we define information in the book as being the phenomena around us. So think about it, very roughly speaking, as reality. And we define knowledge as the human-created interpretation of this phenomena. Now, because it's a human creation, because knowledge is a human creation, it's always going to be partial at best, which means that there is power in defining what counts as knowledge and in creating knowledge. And we make this particular information knowledge distinction in order to highlight a key point about data. Namely, that data itself isn't a building block towards knowledge. You don't take data and build knowledge out of that. Data itself is a form of knowledge. As Lisa Gittleman and others have said, there's no such thing as raw data. Raw data is an oxymoron. Now, what this means is that data itself is always and everywhere contingent, political, and it reflects value judgments. So both the control over knowledge and the definition of what constitutes knowledge are highly political. And it's this battle for control over knowledge that defines our current moment. Now, one of the things we wanted to do in the book was to develop a theoretical framework that we and others could use. It's a way of thinking to help us understand the origins and workings of this knowledge-driven society. And to construct our theory, we draw on the field of international political economy, particularly the work of three theorists, Susan Strange, Robert Cox, and Karl Polanyi. Now, a lot of scholars have defined our current moment in terms of specific characteristics. We all know the phrases. It's the digital age, the network society, surveillance capitalism. We could go on for days. But what all these have in common is a focus on the control over knowledge and an emphasis on the actors like, say, Google or Amazon, who play a dominant role in collecting, organizing, and disseminating the world's knowledge. And this brings us to our first theorist, Susan Strange, who it's the centenary of her birth. 2023 was centenary of her birth. Susan Strange isn't really read outside of IP. And while I think she's relatively still well known in the UK, not really that well known in the rest of the world or in the rest of academia, which is a shame. And not only because of the general importance of her work, but because her work on structural power speaks directly to our current moment. Now, essentially, Strange argued that the ability to set the rules and norms under which others operate, what she called structural power, was a key form of power in the global political economy. And she also argued that four forms of structural power were particularly important in this regard. And these are security, finance, production, and knowledge. Now, from a Strangian perspective, we can understand our current moments in terms of the changing relative importance of these four structures. Specifically, we argue in the book that our current moment can be understood as involving the rising dominance of what she called the knowledge structure, in which state and non-state actors associated with the control of knowledge regulation, that is, the rules and norms governing the creation, dissemination, and use of knowledge have pride and place in shaping the overall direction of society. It also privileges those state and non-state actors who can exert structural power over these rules and norms and who are seen to possess and control socially legitimate and valuable knowledge. And in this case, when I say socially legitimate knowledge, I'm talking about commodified knowledge, specifically intellectual property and data. In the book, we identify three main implications of the rise of the knowledge structure. And the first one has to do with its transformation of political and economic policy and objectives. So one of Strange's most important insights was that structural power, say over knowledge, can be wielded not just by state actors, but non-state actors as well. And these state and non-state actors compete and cooperate with each other for the creation and exercise of structural power. International political economy scholar Robert Cox, a Canadian IPA scholar who taught at York University, where Natasha is based out of, and who passed away a few years ago, Cox called these conglomerations of actors state-society complexes or forms of state. Now, a world in which other types of structural power, such as, say, over security or over finance, is ascendant, it empowers different actors and it pursues different goals than one in which another structure, like, say, knowledge, is dominant. And these dynamics imply that with these changing hierarchies of structures, you're also going to get a changing hierarchy of actors dominated by different forms of state, or again, state-society complexes. The state and non-state actors who dominate policy making and can wield consequential structural power. So in a financialized state, these would tend to be, say, finance ministries or banks or hedge funds and actors like that. In a military state, you could imagine it would be the military, security services, mercenaries, and those involved in providing security services. Now, each form of state has its own dominant players and primary policy objectives. Now, I should also say, just one tiny caveat here is, when we wrote the book, we wanted it to be as accessible as possible, so we tried to avoid as much jargon as possible. So coming up in just a moment is our one piece of kind of nasty jargon. So hopefully it won't be too bad. So in the book, we argue that the financialized state is currently being overtaken, and here's the word, by what we call the information imperium state. I apologize, it's a weird word. We weren't able to come up with anything better. For the information imperium state, the dominant players are those actors that exert control over commodified knowledge, such as data. And our current moment is particularly distinctive because most of the players who have this power are in the private sector. These are, think of our beloved tech companies. Now, the knowledge structure, like other structures, has its own particular logic, which other actors will tend to follow. And the dominance of the information imperium state and the knowledge structure generally helps to explain the emergence of the platform as a dominant business model. And as Nick Strenichek points out in his still invaluable Platform Capitalism, companies in every sector are retooling themselves to maximize their ability to capture data, which they can then either use themselves or sell to others. So for example, as someone told me at a clean tech conference a few years ago, it used to be that the value of a sensor would be in the sale of the sensor. But now the value of the sensor is in the data that it collects. The manufactured thing here has become a means to an end, and it's the data that's become valuable. And so that's the essence both of the knowledge-driven society and economy, but also gives you a sense of how a society or economy can be changed from one in which one structure, say production, is dominant, to one in which it's the knowledge structure that's dominant. So the ascendance of the knowledge structure has also reshaped public policy. Just as a financialized state prioritizes shareholder return, the information imperium state and knowledge-driven society follows its own logic. And the logic of the knowledge-driven society is this: if you don't collect all the data, if you don't control all the knowledge in the form of intellectual property, you're going to be leaving security or profit on the table. So that's why the surveillance problem is so hard, even for liberal democracies. In a knowledge-driven society, to limit surveillance is to limit profit, it's to limit security. And that last point is, for me at least, it's a good reminder that the information imperium state and what we're witnessing right now, it's not just an economic phenomenon. It's also about security as well as economics. Now, the focus on power through the control of knowledge has rewritten the book, not just on security, but also on economic development. So, for example, economic development used to be manufacturing driven. In contrast, strong enforceable global intellectual property rights has created a world of global value chains in which the profits flow to those companies that control the IP and leave everyone else, including those who actually do the manufacturing and the hard work of building the stuff, fighting for scraps. It's a hierarchical world of economic development. And as Mark Schwartz notes in a really fantastic Review of International Political Economy article from 2 or 3 years ago, this supposedly kind of like new datafied high-tech world resembles nothing so much as the franchise model popularized by that very famous high-tech company, McDonald's. It's a world in which head office gets the profit that controls the valuable IP. They get the profits. The franchisee takes all the risk while having no power over their circumstances and getting relatively little profit for all their work. So suffice to say that this thinking about how intellectual property is actually functioning to structure markets and distribute economic opportunities isn't fully reflected in most countries' trade negotiation strategies. Now, geopolitically, we argue that this collected all impetus also rewires the main economic fault lines to follow two dominant strategies, what we call knowledge feudalism and digital economic nationalism. We're used to thinking about the international economy in rough terms of, say, free trade versus protectionism. Normatively, for the past 30 or so years, and up until very, very recently, the assumption has been that cross-border flows are good, restrictions are bad. And this is all underwritten in the economic sphere by the theory of comparative advantage, where trade liberalization can, at least under certain circumstances, be a win-win situation. But trade logic really doesn't fit a world in which the main cross-border flows are knowledge flows. In the knowledge-driven society, the game is to control as much knowledge as possible, and this leads to our two competing but complementary strategies. So on the one hand, the knowledge feudalist strategy is followed by those companies and countries that already control economically valuable knowledge. Their best strategy, as they see it, is to maximize protection over knowledge, as well as maximizing the free flows of this protected knowledge. This control allows them to exercise monopoly control and exert monopoly rents over the actors and countries that require access to their knowledge in order to create their own knowledge. And when you realize that this new knowledge is created, that new knowledge is always created from existing knowledge, the power and logic of this approach becomes clear, at least if you're a knowledge feudalist. Now, in today's world, knowledge feudalist strategies are mostly pursued by the United States and US companies, although the European Union is also in this game in areas like, say, geographical indicators. And the goal in both those cases, it's not to promote growth, it's to extract rents. The second strategy, meanwhile, is followed by those who don't have access to this economically valuable knowledge and need to kind of create it for themselves. And we call this digital economic nationalism. It's a nationalist strategy because often only the state has the capacity to challenge the dominant global knowledge feudalists and to coordinate their own actors. So think of things like sovereign patent funds or national AI strategies. Now, digital economic nationalism in this sense is more open than a knowledge feudalist approach, at least at the country level, where there's going to be more sharing of IP protected knowledge and of data. But in the end, the goal is still the same, which is dominance over knowledge. Now, often digital economic nationalism is interpreted as a form of protectionism or techno-nationalism, but it's best thought of as a logical reaction to knowledge protectionist strategies of the knowledge feudalists. So knowledge feudalism, unlike free trade, is designed to build walls around knowledge and charge for access. Focusing on the free cross-border flows of this knowledge misses the most important fact of who controls the knowledge in the first place. So these strong protections are essentially protectionist and they're essentially feudalist. So all that for the first implication. Now, the second one has to do with the nature of the knowledge that's being promoted and seen as valuable. And as I said, it's not just about the control of knowledge itself becoming more important, but what type of knowledge is being privileged and is being considered most important. And in our world, that is commodified knowledge. So both data and intellectual property are examples of what Karl Polanyi calls fictitious commodities. These are things that we treat as if they were produced for the market, but they were actually have some other purpose. They don't emerge out of the market itself. And the three ones that Polanyi, writing in the 1940s, focused on were land, labor, and money. And he argued that when we forget that, say, land isn't just natural resources to be bought and sold, but the biosphere that we depend on to live, then we as a society run into big trouble. And we're kind of seeing that right now with the climate emergency. This is why we have environmental laws. It's why we have labor laws. It's why we have, say, central banks and not the gold standard. Those two being to ensure that the financial system itself doesn't self-correct individuals and businesses into oblivion. The goal in all three of these cases is to limit the harm from treating human lives and the environment as means to others' ends or the market's end, rather than as ends in and of themselves. And data and intellectual property are fictitious commodity forms of knowledge, things produced for an end in and of themselves, but are turned into things that can be bought and sold or used for purposes other than which they were intended. And I think this is pretty obvious in terms of intellectual property. So, think of a vaccine. Vaccines are designed, as we know, to protect people from illness. But when a vaccine, the drug formula is turned into intellectual property, it can be bought and sold at extortionate prices that will certainly benefit the bottom line of the owner of the intellectual property, but may place it outside the reach of the people who need these drugs and vaccines, often to even just survive. And so the same is true with respect to data, but I'll get to the data example in momentarily. But here the important thing is recognizing data and IP as plenty and fictitious commodities, and the policy response that we will get to in a moment will become clear, which is knowledge decommodification, limiting the commodification of these things in the first place. But like I said, we'll get to that. Third implication, though, of the argument in our book. It's probably the most important, and it was, for me at least, it was the most fun to write about or to think about. So throughout the book, we illustrate a lot of our arguments with the leitmotif of Google's failed attempt to build a smart neighborhood in Toronto a few years ago. The attempt made international headlines, so you might have heard of it, but if not, no worries. What's important is, for the purposes of this presentation, although I'd be happy to talk about it, it was incredibly weird. For us, the big question that we were left with at the end of the day, and it's not a rhetorical question, is who in their right mind would believe that an advertising and search engine company could actually design and build a neighborhood, let alone the smart cities that Google was planning on and wanted to do with down the road. And like I said, this is not a rhetorical question, and it's a question that we can ask about any number of policy areas. We all know that large tech companies have inserted themselves into every single policy field that we could imagine, from health to education to government services. If you could think of a policy field, Google or some other company is thinking of a way to insert themselves into it if they haven't done so already. And they're not doing it as tech support, but as they're doing it as kind of they want to be transformative leaders, they're basically where things get reworked around their ideas, their technology. And this is a change because the dominance of the knowledge structure is not just about which companies get rich. Power in knowledge also involves power to decide what counts as knowledge, which we refer to as knowledge legitimation. But and here the crucial point is that it also implies a change in who we consider to be experts and what we consider to be valuable expertise. And in this case that we're looking at, expertise is accruing to those actors who are seen to be able to collect and analyze digital data. And here's where we come to the new knowledge in the title of the book. Google, of course, so I said it wasn't a rhetorical question. In a sense, it is a rhetorical question because everybody knows why Google was chosen for this job, because they seem to have a facility with data. But that is the interesting thing, that is what people focus on. That I think is the most fascinating thing about that project. But more importantly, the officials who invited Google to the table were the ones who saw that its general technical expertise in data is more important than specialized expertise in urban design. The new knowledge, in other words, privileges decontextualized data as superior to theory-based scientific knowledge. It privileges technical skill in finding correlations to subject matter, or even what we could call scientific knowledge. And this is a new ideology. It's what Jose Van Dyke calls dataism. It's the belief that social relations can be reduced to data, and that this data need only be analyzed for correlations to create a neutral, superior form of knowledge. Because this knowledge is decontextualized knowledge, it privileges commodified knowledge that can be, again, used against the interests of those who originally produced this knowledge in a specific context. And this, again, and all this is feeding into the idea of knowledge decommodification, which I promise I will get to at some point. But before I do that, I want to spend a few minutes outlining some of the findings that we have in the book as far as regarding how states and firms are expressing power through data. As I've noted, the transformation to a knowledge-driven society is having pervasive economic, social, and political effects. And the book explores these effects, how both states and corporate actors are increasingly expressing power through the capture and interpretation of data. Governments, and I should say here, it's both democratic governments and authoritarian governments, are susceptible to dataist claims that perfect objective knowledge is possible through capturing and sorting mass amounts of data. Governments, for their part, are using data tools to govern and to manage and deliver public services. And in part, this involves using data tools that promise actionable, accurate predictions of future events and behavior. Now, as we all know, or as we should know, precise predictions of behavior are often deeply flawed. They can often replicate existing powers of patterns, I should say, of discrimination and bias. Dataism as an ideology, in fact, amounts to a denial of this reality. In the book, we also explain how companies are intensifying their focus to commodify IP and data. And as I've already mentioned, companies are using IP to shift the global economy from an international trade model to one based on global supply chains. And companies are retooling their business models to capture and monetize data. And this is what this looks like. It looks like that tractor. And for example, US agricultural giant John Deere now describes itself as a tech firm. John Deere employs more software engineers than physical design engineers, the people who actually build the tractors themselves or the agricultural equipment themselves. John Deere refers to tractors as mobile sensor suites with computational capacity to stream data continuously. John Deere captures data from tractor sensors and then aggregates this data and sells it back to farmers as valuable knowledge about their crops and their growing conditions. Now, farmers, John Deere says, still own their farming data collected by these tractors. However, the value from that data comes from interpreting it, something that individual farmers are less able to do without the infrastructure, that is, the algorithms needed to actually process, interpret, and then use this data. So what this means is that John Deere is in a privileged position of interpreting, defining, and selling knowledge about agriculture. Even though the farmer might still own the underlying data, it doesn't really matter much because it's the processing and the refining and then the selling back that's the actual, that's actually important. This is structural power in the knowledge economy. Farmers, meanwhile, are in a position of data dependency with little control over where their farming data flows or who uses it. We also explore how companies position themselves as consequential data governance actors capable of exerting what we term private data power. In an economy centered around the control of data, power resides with those companies capable of harvesting and processing vast amounts of data. Power accrues to those with, again, the claimed ability to make interpretations of data that produce authoritative knowledge, and again, claimed authoritative knowledge of behavior or events. Companies express structural power through data in two main ways. The first one is they use automated data tools designed to forecast future events and behavior. And secondly, through data-driven standard setting. Now, in terms of predictions, companies use automated data tools to draw from large data sets in order to make forecasts that they claim are precise and accurate. Companies claim the ability to determine who will be an ideal immigrant or a risky parolee or a failing student or a credit risk. Firms market these forecasts as having predictive accuracy, while others, like governments, accord these forecasts with social and economic legitimacy by buying their products. Structural power is evident in companies' claims of predictive knowledge. Data-driven forecasting is powerful because business and governments act as if the predictions are valid, reliable representations of reality. But these claims rest upon very shaky foundations of data accuracy and the precision and the claimed precision of automated tools that they do not really live up to. Now, for standard setting, which is the second one, we examine tech firms' expansion into the health sector. Amazon and Palantir, among other companies, are applying their expertise in data analytics to build the next generation of diagnostic and treatment tools and to manage the delivery of healthcare. And we focus on Google's DeepMind AI company and Google's acquisition of Fitbit in particular. So companies like Google and other big data players have the commercial and technical resources to amass high quality data sets and to build AI tools. And they also control ownership of the IP rights pertaining to the data collection and interpretation technologies. So as a result, they can make valuable scientific knowledge inaccessible or unaffordable to those who might need it most. Big tech reaps the financial benefits of their dominant position in global value chains and from their position as holders of the right legitimate knowledge. Now, all that is pretty, there's a lot of downers in what I've been talking about. But we really do, we both come from government, and so we're also very interested in kind of like policy options. And so we try to have some of those in the book. And in particular, we're interested in like a path beyond knowledge feudalism and digital economic nationalism. This is where we propose what we call knowledge decommodification. So again, drawing on Polanyi's concept of fictitious commodities, and how, and thinking about how, if we forget that land is a fictitious commodity, then we're going to be in the climate emergency. And so societies have passed laws that limit the commodification of these key things. And my notes just completely disappeared. 1 second. Okay. My apologies. All right, here we go. So we argue that data and IP are fictitious commodities, again, things that exist before they're beyond their assigned role as commodities in the marketplace. The knowledge protected by IP rights has purposes beyond marketplace assets. Like I said, the ability to create life-saving drugs. The purpose of these things is not to maximize profit. It is to prevent illness. Data also is a fictitious commodity. So for example, think about if those of you who have a Fitbit, you use those Fitbits in order to track your nutritional intake or to track your exercise, your steps, those kinds of things. And this is how Fitbits are intended to use. This is the point of the data collection. This is the direct point of data collection for Fitbits. They don't work if you don't have that data. But when Fitbit provides this data to insurance companies, it takes the data out of the context within which it was produced, and the data becomes a fictitious commodity. Users might not be aware or fully understand the implications of this kind of data dissemination. Insurance companies can use this data to raise premiums for some or to deny coverage altogether. Governments can use this as maybe an input into health policy to decide, again, how different groups should be treated or what policy should be adopted. So commodification occurs not just in the market, but it's also a security issue. So people use social media to build social networks and to share ideas and culture. But police can repurpose this social media data to profile and track people. So repurposing data from its original context transforms it into a commodity and causes some issues. Restricting knowledge commodification protected by IP would ensure that this knowledge is used for the purpose it was created, like say to deliver life-saving drugs. Now, when we talk about IP decommodification, it would basically involve pushing back on the current IP regime, limiting terms, scope, and duration of IP rights. Knowledge, the principle being knowledge should be used to promote innovation, and the current IP regime is pretty much almost universally acknowledged by people who look at it to actually discourage innovation while protecting incumbents against competition. So think about, for instance, patent protections on clean tech can restrict the dissemination of clean technologies that we will need in order, if we want to have a fighting chance of basically mitigating the climate emergency. Data decommodification requires that data only be used for the purposes for which it was originally collected, like people using Fitbit data just to track exercise. Decommodification here entails putting the user's interests ahead of the actor, which could be a business, it could be government, it could also be a nonprofit who is collecting this data for their own purposes or repurposing this data. And here's where we need direct government intervention to work towards data decommodification. And so one practical step would be limiting the personal data that data brokers themselves can buy or sell. A slightly more ambitious thing would be to basically ban or severely restrict the actions of data brokers in the industry altogether. Another avenue would involve limiting or outright prohibiting controversial, harmful data, harmful data collection practices by private actors or even by governments. So this might include bans on corporate or government use of facial recognition data, which is highly inaccurate, and restrictions on the collection and use of genetic data, which has a high harm potential. For generative AI, it would involve prohibiting firms from turning existing cultural knowledge, so our books, our artwork, our social media posts, into data to train algorithms to make chatbots. We also need to limit the commodification of some non-personal data, such as farming data that would help counter power asymmetries between farmers and big agri-data firms. Farmers, for instance, may feel that they have little choice but to adopt corporate data-driven farming. So, in writing this, both Natasha and I recognize that calls to decommodified knowledge, as we've set them out here, may seem almost utopian, but we would argue that the fact that it does seem utopian is a reflection of the fact that we do live in a commodified knowledge-driven society. So we conclude our book with some ambitious policy recommendations beyond those, and I'll just mention one here, which is the importance of democratic accountability to move towards decommodification. So in tech and internet governance, there is a general suspicion often amongst a lot of people working on these issues of government action, and seeing government action or regulation in this area can be potentially problematic in a way that ignores firms' structural power in this area. So in a society in which governments are often seen as ill-equipped or even illegitimate to regulate digital issues, civil society, often people hold out the hope that civil society can kind of step into the gap somehow. But civil society itself cannot rule on its own. In fact, instead, it's only able to influence government and firms. And so that's why it's absolutely so crucial that there be democratic government control and regulation on these issues. And we're always encouraged to see, like, in Europe, and again, UK and the European Union, there's more action on this than especially in Canada, and the United States is only now starting to get on board with that. But the importance of this cannot be overstated. And we're also thinking, like, governments need to restrict the type of personal data that private actors can collect and monetize, which are important elements of data decommodification, while also resisting their own dataist impulses. So yeah, so I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. The book itself is, as it says here, it's available for open access, and on the Rowman and Littlefield website, you have to dig to find it, but it is there and it's free to download. I'll also, because this is an academic thing, we always make sure to put our sources at the end. These are things that we refer to directly, not just in the book, but in the presentation. So if anyone wants a copy of that, we can provide that as well. But thank you very much.